Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our Birmingham ESRC Festival of Social Science events, in which we're going to discuss current issues on dyslexia, a topic that has been around in education for such a long time. My name is Maria Raraki, and together with my colleague Vicky Anderson, we run the dyslexia course here at the University of Birmingham. Both of us will be chairing the event tonight with a fantastic lineup of speakers who will address areas of identification and support for dyslexia across all stages in education. The talks will do that from both research and practical perspectives. The presentations have been designed based on questions some of you have already sent us. However, the chairs will select one or two questions for the presenters to address after each talk. A few housekeeping points before we start, please. So as you realize, you are in listen-only mode. However, please feel free to post your questions using the Q&A function, the question and answer function on Zoom. The event will be recorded and it will be uploaded shortly after it finishes. Now, without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce you all to our first speaker, Professor Margaret Snowling, who has very kindly prepared a recorded talk for tonight's webinar. So let me get the video, please.
And I'd like to begin by thanking you for inviting me today to give a short introduction to the session on dyslexia, in which I'm going to be talking about some of the current issues in dyslexia. I'm very sorry not to be with you, but as I speak, I am on my way to Belgium to a conference which is also about current concepts in dyslexia and is discussing the use of educational apps. The history of dyslexia is a long one. It was first described at the end of the 19th century, and some 70 years later, the World Federation of Neurology got together in London to discuss and to decide on a definition of dyslexia. That is given in this slide. So in 1968, the World Federation of Neurology met to discuss dyslexia and to come to a consensus on which were the most salient dyslexia manifestations. It stated dyslexia is a disorder manifested by difficulty in learning to read despite conventional instruction, adequate intelligence, and sociocultural opportunity. It is dependent upon fundamental cognitive disabilities, which are frequently of constitutional origin. Now, that definition was much criticized over the ensuing years for several reasons. It's a definition by exclusion. That is, according to this definition, you can only be dyslexic if you've had conventional instruction, that you have adequate intelligence and good educational opportunity. And of course, if dyslexia is actually dependent on some fundamental cognitive disabilities, then it should exist regardless of the instruction you receive, your intelligence level, and the opportunities that you have. Not only is the history of dyslexia long, it's somewhat surprising to me that I have now been in this field for almost 50 years. And looking back, we have made a lot of progress, and that really leads me to be talking to you about what some of the current issues in the field are. So I've chosen 3 or 4 issues that I think are currently occupying the minds of dyslexia researchers and those who practice dyslexia. First of all, whereas in the days of the World Federation of Neurology definition, dyslexia was being thought of as a clinical category, something that could be accurately defined, and that is really no longer the case. We no longer think of dyslexia as a discrete disorder that requires some kind of clinical diagnosis. This is not unusual in the disorders that we know of. When we think about something like depression, People's moods can vary from very low to very elated. There's no cutoff that says this person is depressed, and yet it is useful to use the term depression to describe someone of very low mood who requires some kind of intervention or medication. So just like depression, dyslexia is a dimensional disorder. We also no longer think about dyslexia as only occurring in people of high or adequate intelligence. Indeed, that sort of definition, which was referred to as a discrepancy definition, has really been outdated since the late 1980s. We now know that reading disorder can occur on a spectrum, but I'll come back in a moment to discuss a little bit about what that means, about the kinds of difficulties that get placed under the term dyslexia. I also want us to think a little bit about the term specific, because dyslexia is not always a specific disorder. The notion it was a specific reading difficulty or selective neurodevelopmental disorder is itself outdated. We know now that people with dyslexia often have other problems as well. It almost never occurs on its own. So many people with dyslexia have attention problems, have motor problems, have language problems. And what the terminology used in the literature for this is comorbidity or co-occurrence. So comorbidity is the rule, not the exception. And because there are many different sorts of risks around dyslexia, we also know that many risks, if they accumulate, are what can lead to a threshold of a definite diagnosis. There isn't any category of dyslexia. It can be diagnosed when there is a certain level of severity or persistence, and that's often when there are many risk factors in play. So one important issue for researchers is to identify the research factors associated with dyslexia or that can lead to dyslexia. That's particularly important early on, when early interventions for language and reading can prevent a downward spiral of poor reading, poor learning, poor motivation, and possibly disengagement from education. So how can we think about risks? This is a sort of risk framework that just reminds us that risks can occur at a number of different levels: at the biological level, at the cognitive level, or at the environmental level. But what we're always doing is measuring at the behavioral level, or almost always at the behavioral level. So let's think first of all about biological risks. We know that dyslexia and reading are very heritable. Dyslexia is associated with many genes of small effect, and they have an impact through brain systems and through the environment. They lead at the cognitive level to certain sorts of difficulty, which can then create problems for learning to read. And there's a very strong consensus that the core phonological deficit in dyslexia is a phonological one, a difficulty dealing with the speech sounds of spoken language. But that might not be the only risk factor affecting an individual. They may have other risk factors, described here as endophenotypes. They may, for instance, also have a touch of language disorder or a touch of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And the more risks that they are and accumulate, the stronger the likelihood of a diagnosis. So at the phenotypical level, the phenotype is the manifestation of dyslexia. The more risk factors, the more likely that manifestation will suggest a certain level of severity or complexity that deserves a diagnosis. So what we're thinking about here then is actually a continuum or a dimension, depending on the risk factors and their individual severity. And on that continuum, people with dyslexia will either have a mild form or a more severe form. With the mild end, they have something sometimes called compensated or broader phenotype of dyslexia, where you may see some of the symptoms, say poor spelling or slow reading, but you don't get the full-grown dyslexic profile. So dyslexia is a dimensional disorder, and it can occur on all levels of the IQ spectrum. But what then does that actually mean? Like if dyslexia reading can be impaired in someone of higher IQ, is that the same as having dyslexia with someone with lower IQ? Well, this is where complexity comes in. If a child has an oral language problem, or more severely, if they have developmental language disorder, they're going to have a lower verbal IQ. If you allow into the diagnosis of dyslexia, people with lower verbal IQs, you're more likely to have comorbidities with language problems. If someone has some kind of executive, attention, or motor difficulty, they're likely to come down on performance IQ tests. They'll get lower performance IQ. If you have individuals who have an IQ which is associated with poor performance IQ, they're more likely to have co-occurring attention or motor difficulties. And then aside from IQ itself, because language is so important as a foundation for learning to read, if you have children who come to school with poor language, perhaps because they've had limited exposure, let's say they're a refugee, or they're from a family home where English is not the first language, those lower language skills will place them at risk of poor literacy, particularly poor reading comprehension. So educational outcomes for children with dyslexia depend on complex picture of interactions between deficits, which themselves are dimensional. Phonological skills range from mild to severe. Strengths, better language is supportive. And compensatory resources. And the most important complementary resource is, of course, intervention. And good intervention will do a great deal to mitigate the risks of dyslexia. And I want to just emphasize how important spoken language is as a foundation. Let me tell you a little bit about an empirical study. We did a longitudinal study in which we followed the development of children who were at risk of significant reading problems or dyslexia for two sorts of reasons. Either because they were at family risk of dyslexia, they had a parent or a sibling with dyslexia, or because in the preschool years they had a language difficulty with vocabulary or understanding. And we compared their development to that of children who were at low risk of reading difficulties because they had no family risk and they had no language difficulties. This slide shows the outcomes of children in those groups at the age of 8 in terms of their reading and spelling, and hence looks at the proportion or the prevalence of dyslexia in the groups. So on the left of the slide are children who have typical language in preschool, and on the right, children whose language was of concern in preschool. The blue bars are children who have no family risk of dyslexia, and the orange bars are children who are at family risk of dyslexia. So the first thing to say is if you have neither a family risk nor a language difficulty, about 7% of such children have dyslexia at age 8. And that's about the prevalence that we would expect in a normal population. Population epidemiological studies show that. If you have a family risk of dyslexia, but you've got good language in preschool, 26% of that group are dyslexic. That's a high prevalence compared to the 7%. It's almost 4 times as likely a risk of dyslexia. Now, if you have a language impairment in preschool, your risks are increased. So if you have a language impairment, but you're not at family risk, 26% of those children have dyslexia. If you are language impaired and you're at family risk, then 40% are impaired. So we have a kind of additivity here, family risk and language in the preschool together make a greater risk than either risk alone. The risks are even more stepwise or additive if instead of thinking about preschool language, we think about a child with a language difficulty at age 8 at the same time as we're assessing their reading. And those data are shown on this slide. So what we do here is we measure dyslexia at age 8 using tests of reading and spelling. And we look first of all at the typical children. 7% of them have dyslexia, same as on the last slide. Now you take children at family risk of dyslexia who don't have a language impairment at 8, 17% of them are dyslexic. If you have a language impairment at age 8, 35% are dyslexic. And if you have a language impairment and you're at family risk, 45% are dyslexic. This is what we refer to as additive risk factors. And you can imagine if you add into this also having ADHD, also having some kind of motor problem, the probability of a dyslexia outcome actually increases. The central problem is one of language skills and specifically phonological skills. I've been focusing then on sort of biological and biologically determined cognitive risks, but of course environmental factors are also very important. And I already referred to the child who comes to school because they've had limited exposure to language, they're at risk of having reading problems. But there are quite a lot of other issues as well for children who are at risk of dyslexia. Here we see a child reading, and in their immediate environment, there are factors which can affect their literacy development. There could be home literacy factors, there could be school literacy factors, depending on the quality of the teacher, whether or not they teach phonics. There could be a peer group issue, particularly for older children. Is reading in boys not such a good thing to do? And there are also health issues. Of course, during COVID, there have been a lot of absences that have affected children's development in a variety of curriculum areas. There are also other factors that are outside of the microenvironment. For instance, the neighbourhood in which you live. This may determine the quality of the school that you go to. And at a macro level, the government funding that's available, the educational policy, and the cultural value placed on literacy. So you can see that given a few small genetic effects predisposing someone for dyslexia, it's quite a long way to journey between that risk and the educational or dyslexic outcome. So what are the implications for theory, policy and practice? Well, first of all, it's clear that there are many risks associated with dyslexia and multiple pathways. We know, and we've firmed up with longitudinal studies, that dyslexia is associated with phonological difficulties, and these are actually early onset. So in our longitudinal study, from 3.5, children who went on to be dyslexic had poor phonological skills. That risk factor for dyslexia is the same across languages. So even in non-alphabetic languages, children who have that problem with language and the manipulation of speech sounds, perhaps on a larger level than the phoneme, perhaps at the syllable level, are at risk of dyslexia. And in an alphabetic language like English, those difficulties lead to an impact on the development of decoding and spelling. In more regular orthographies, often children can learn to decode okay, but they're slow to do so. Also, poor phonology is not just a risk factor for that you see in dyslexic risk studies, it's also there in children with language disorders. As you acquire language, your phonological system also improves. If you have poor language, your phonological system will also be delayed in its development. So children with DLD share a risk factor with dyslexic children, that is poor phonology, which is going to preclude their reading development. We also now know that children who have poor language at school entry are most at risk. So if you have a language problem early on at 2 or 3, as long as you recover by 5, that's going to be much better for your later progress. And we also know that children who are not proficient in the language of learning are at risk of problems, particularly with reading comprehension. Often they get off with decoding quite well. So dyslexia itself is heterogeneous, and it may share additional comorbidities. It may co-occur with developmental language disorder or with ADHD, for example. But now the good news, dyslexia and underlying language disorders are amenable to intervention. And now there is increasing need for evidence-based interventions. These are going to be the interventions that the government believes in and funds. It's fortunate that a number of robust randomized trials have now been conducted on these sorts of interventions. This is just a few of the ones that we've done. We've shown that a parent-delivered language intervention in preschool can work and is effective. We've shown that early years language interventions are effective in improving oral language and may have a later impact on reading comprehension. We've shown that language interventions in the middle school years can improve reading comprehension, strangely more so than reading interventions themselves. And in some recent work that we've done with the Education Endowment Foundation, we've found strong evidence for the efficacy of a language intervention program in reception class called Nellie, delivered by teaching assistants. And we found that Nellie not only boosts the skills of English-speaking children, but also skills of children with English as an additional language, and there's no weaker effect for that group of children. So if you don't know about Nelly, and if you are from a school who still would like to take part, may I suggest you go to this Nelly website, www.teachnelly.org, or just Google Nelly Early Language Intervention. I should say I show no conflicts here. We receive no royalties from the sales of this program. The royalties go to the Knuckle Foundation, who drive the money back into research. So with that, let me close, wishing you really a very good session. And I know that sharing good practice is always very helpful. So please enjoy that. Thank you.
A very interesting talk from Professor Maggie Snowling, although most of us know her around from our dyslexia practice and research. I should have said that Maggie Snowling is currently the president and honorary professor in the Department of Experimental Psychology in St. College in Oxford. Her research over the years has focused on children's language and learning, with a particular interest in the nature and causes of children's reading difficulties and how to best ameliorate them. In 2016, Professor Maggie Snowling was appointed CB for Services to Science and the Understanding of Dyslexia. So now it's time to move on to our first live mini talk, and over to my colleague Vicky, who will chair that one.
Thank you. So we'd like to give a very warm welcome to Dr. Harriet Cameron. Harriet is a lecturer in psychology and education at the University of Sheffield, where she undertakes research around learning identities and lived experience of marginalisation in connection with learning disabilities, specific learning difficulties and autism, and around educational psychology practice. Her academic career follows many years as a service director and specialist teacher in higher education for students with specific learning difficulties, including dyslexia. She currently leads modules concentrating on inclusive education and critical psychology. And this evening, Harriet is going to focus on supporting dyslexic learners in further and higher education. Thank you, Harriet.
Hi, I'm going to share my screen with you all now. So I'll just be one moment. Hopefully you can all see that. Just clicking share, and there we go. Okay, right. So yes, thank you so much, Vicky, for introducing me so well. So I'm currently into my 4th or 5th year as an academic in psychology and education. But before that, I worked as a specialist teacher for students with SBLDs, including dyslexia and ADHD and autism, and led a service at the University of Sheffield, and I thoroughly enjoyed that time. And although I do research around experiences of diagnosis, the questions that I received from this wonderful audience were more about how do we improve communication and collaboration in FEHE between specialist teachers of SBLD and the academic staff. And I guess this is a good question for schools as well, like how do we improve communication? So my research is not on this, but I think I can probably speak to it, having crossed from being a specialist teacher to being an academic. So moving on to my next slide, I promise, there we go. Right, so I thought, well, before we can answer this question of what do we do to improve communication, we need to know what the barriers are. So I come from quite a different background to Maggie Snowling, from a different angle really. So for me, there's a barrier to good practice communication between teachers and students and parents and academics because of the kind of history of what academia is. So university really, it has a very strong historical idea of what counts as a good student, right? It's a student that can read really quickly, process information quickly. It's someone who has a particular confidence in speaking in academic environments. And it's, of course, someone who can write according to the right way that a university expects. And if anyone struggles a little bit with fulfilling that, they end up being a little bit pushed out. So there's some things that we do and we learn which don't require speed reading or don't require excellent writing, but those things often don't receive as much value as those traditional elements. So first of all, when you have a dyslexic student and their parents and a support tutor who's doing their best to help that student manage the course, what they're really pushing against there is a historical construction of what counts as a good student in terms of reading and writing. And also there's a lot of hierarchy. So in universities, there's hierarchy within academic staff. And I think sometimes specialist dyslexia tutors can feel a bit pushed down, like their perspective isn't as valued. And I think that should really change. On top of that, the increasing marketisation of education means that no one really has time to properly support and think and reflect upon their practice. And the bottom point there on the left is one where I agree with Maggie Snowling that I think actually we have an over focus on diagnosis. And I'll come back to that because I feel like sometimes that acts as a gatekeeper when we could go directly to support without necessarily, not in every case, having to jump through those diagnostic hoops. Sometimes it's massively valuable to do that. So I'm not making a blanket statement there. Then I was thinking about the local barriers to kind of communication and support. And I'd started here with insufficient mutual understanding. So academics don't really understand what specialist teachers do. They really don't. And that's based upon the fact that what specialist teachers do is massively complex, undervalued, and actually what a specialist teacher does, having been one and led a service on this, they're not just doing support teaching, they're specialist teachers of language. They also do an amount of counselling, even though they're often told they shouldn't be. That's inevitably an element of what they do. They also have to have an in-depth understanding of the psychological perspective of dyslexia and other specific learning differences or difficulties, as well as understanding the history and the culture and the experience that dyslexic students have. And what they do in those tutorial sessions or in support sessions is kind of incredible. I think, you know, when I speak to students, that has been one of the most transformative experiences in their further or higher education. But academics don't understand what goes on in those sessions. Likewise, I think there's a little bit of misunderstanding of the different pressures that academics are under in terms of having to meet particular learning outcomes and assessment outcomes that are very rigid and hard to change. Okay. I also feel, and I'm sure this isn't true of Birmingham at all, that the training and knowledge around SBLDs is really traditionally deficit focused. So there's so much of value in what Maggie Snowling talked about there, but what I heard was a lot of deficit and risk and disorder. You know, that's the language that tends to dominate. So it's no wonder really that many of our students who've been diagnosed or identified have kind of taken on board that there's a problem, that they are disordered. And so they arrive at university with this kind of, this feeling often of not being very good hanging over them. So there were some of the challenges. I know I'm rushing through this and I'm sure you'll have lots of opinions, but my questions and suggestions, which are highly personal, so I'm not saying this is definitely true, I'm just speaking from experience, but one of the suggestions is that we need to prioritise disability and inclusion on an institutional level, because there needs to be actual time allocated for academic staff to learn about this. And I think we need to ensure that specific learning difficulties tutors or specialists in teaching and so-called just support lead that, and that we don't start with the deficit-based training. I also think it's transformative when specialist tutors and specialist teachers are paid on full-time contracts that recognise the level of their expertise and education, and that they are given time to lead training for staff, because otherwise staff get little snippets of deficit-based 2-hour training slots generically given. I also think there's a role for students to lead on some of that training, so dyslexic students or students with other particular identifications. The discourse is important. The language we use to describe students and their relative difficulties and strengths, and the way we describe so-called support staff. So I keep using this word support. I know they're supportive, but unfortunately in our culture, we tend to derogate and look down upon people who are in support roles. I would prefer specialist teacher or specialist in dyslexia so that people can get a proper recognition for the job they do. So I think the language is massively important. We need regular training. We need to understand the job that teachers do, the challenges they faced, and we need time for attendance. So again, prioritization. Now, my research is often around what diagnosis as a process does, how that acts in the world, the kind of social life of diagnosis, if that makes sense. So there's a lot of emotion and feeling bound up in the diagnostic process leading up to a diagnosis. After you get your full report full of all this scientific sounding language about where you are on the percentiles compared to the rest of the population of your age, what your teachers then do with that, what parents do that, what your academic staff do with that. In some cases, I wonder if all of the time and effort that's spent on diagnosis could be instead directed towards training and support led by specialist tutors who also have an understanding of small tests that you could do to support that process. So I do wonder about sometimes the different gatekeeping levels that students and their supporters have to go through before they can access understanding and support. And here as point F, I've got the recognition of the intersection. So a Black student from a Caribbean background might experience their diagnosis quite differently from a white middle class boy. And I think that recognizing how your community understands what dyslexia is massively then affects the student's understanding of their relative strengths and weaknesses. I think it can be almost worn as a badge of joy. You can be completely proud of your dyslexia identification, and the opposite can also be true. And we need to hear those different experiences to really understand what life is like. And I know dyslexia tutors understand this because they're working very closely with those young people and children, but academic staff one step removed don't, and institutions as massive wholes don't understand that. So I think this is my final slide, so I've nearly finished. So yes, academics, we need to be supported to understand what dyslexia can mean for a learner. And I don't mean what that means in terms of their relative weaknesses, for example, working memory or processing speed, etc. I mean, what role does the identity as dyslexic or diagnosis as dyslexic play in their sense of themselves and their trajectory as a learner? What does it mean to them emotionally? And how is that interacting with their sense of themselves as a learner? We also as academics need to understand the kind of magic that dyslexia specialists do when they work with children and young people in university and in schools, because they are they can create a transformative experience for that young person. And specialist tutors should also be supported to understand that the institutional constraints and module specific constraints on departments. So sometimes it's really hard to move on a point, and it's an individual academic is quite limited in their power to move that. And also they are struggling for time because of the workload pressures, and so there's a lot going on for them. And also there's a variability on what might be considered a reasonable or unreasonable adjustment according to the Equality Act. So depending on what the assessment is looking at, some changes which might seem straightforward actually aren't reasonable in the context of learning outcomes of that particular module. So that's what I've come to learn now I'm on the other side of it. So there's lots more I could talk about, including the problem of when diagnoses are removed or students don't quite meet the threshold. So when you have students told, oh yeah, you have some dyslexic traits, but we can't quite give you a full diagnosis. And suddenly they're cut off from all resources. It seems like you either are or you aren't. And I appreciate we need lines, but I think there are a lot of students who, for whatever reason, don't quite meet the threshold, despite having a lot of support needs in HEFE. So I think that's it from me. I think I'm sure I've talked for 10 minutes. Thank you ever so much for listening. And I hope that that was useful, if personal. Yeah, thank you very much. I will mute myself now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Harriet, for a very interesting and thought-provoking talk. I can see one question in the Q&A, and I'm also aware that somebody else has raised their hand, but I'm not sure what we can do about that. If I just give you this one question for now, the question is, should dyslexia be diagnosed by the health service, not education?
Goodness, I don't know if I'm best placed. I think maybe Katrina will be better placed to ask this. If it was personal preference, I'd like to move it away from sounding anything remotely medical, because it's not. You know, I think that the reason we need diagnoses at all is because of the way education is set up. If it was set up differently, we might find we don't really need to diagnose nearly as much, and suddenly the disordered elements will dissipate or become less prominent. So I guess I would prefer it was more educationally leaning, but that's only personal, so I really can't speak beyond that. I hope that's helpful.
The next question is, what is known about the strengths associated with a dyslexic profile?
Again, I can only really speak informally here because my research isn't about this. And I think there are people who look very much at the positive psychology of dyslexia, but I'm sure every other specialist tutor would say the same thing, that anecdotally, I feel like there is a great deal of creativity, an ability to see connections between things, to see whole pictures, to be able to understand social connections and empathize in a way that I don't see as often in other groups. But whether that's because that's a result of having to find new ways of doing things because you meet walls, or because it's part of a kind of cognitive setup, I don't think I can comment. And I think it can be a bit dangerous to say that dyslexic people are better at X, because of course one dyslexic person is one dyslexic person, and there's a full range of strengths and weaknesses, and there's a bit of a danger in the discourse which says such and such genius was dyslexic. And it's the same with autism and ADHD. You can be ordinary and that's fine. Let's celebrate the average here, and dyslexic. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Harriet. That was so stimulating. I'd now like to turn our attention to Katrina Cochrane. So welcome to our meeting. Katrina is the Acting Director of Education and Professional Studies for the British Dyslexia Association, also known as the BDA. She's been a specialist teacher and assessor for over 20 years. She's a member of the BDA Accreditation Board and is also a trustee for the Adult Dyslexia Centre. Katrina is going to speak to us about the identification of dyslexia across the phases of education. Thank you, Katrina.
Hello, good evening, everybody. It's really nice to be here.
Sorry to interrupt. You are on. Yes. You're on speaker view, so you can see your notes.
Oh right, okay. Let me just come out of there. That's strange, isn't it? Let me just stop share. Come back in again.
Yeah, perfect. You just want to make it full screen.
Doing well this tonight, aren't I?
Wonderful, thank you.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Really nice to be here. And I'm very interested in listening to the other two speakers, because in some ways I'm going to go against some of the things that a couple of the other speakers said, particularly around things about assessment being deficit focused. As as has been said, I'm a specialist assessor. I've been assessing children and adults for about 20 years now. So I'm passionate about assessment, and I think it's a really, really positive thing. I was always told that the child should go out of the assessment 6 inches taller than when they came in. And I see that in children when they come in, their shoulders are hunched, they feel very negative about themselves, and they do go out of the assessment feeling so much better and taller. So it is a really, really positive thing, I think, getting an assessment done. As Maggie was saying, and she's quite right, comorbidity is the rule. And with the children that I see the range of different difficulties within their profile. The biggest overlap is between dyspraxia and dyslexia, so an awful lot of that. I'm the mother of a child with dyslexia and dyspraxia. He's now an adult, and interestingly has just been assessed with ADHD. So he's got a lot of these different things there. And as Maggie was saying, developmental language disorder there also. So all of these things are the norm with the children that we assess. We know from the Rose Review that dyslexia is a learning difficulty that primarily affects accurate and fluent word reading and spelling. It's not the only thing at all. Some of the universities, the majority of the university students that I assess, of course they can read. They can't read the volume of text, can they? So it's not just about reading. And many non-dyslexic children are poor spellers as well, aren't they? So it's around phonological awareness, it's around verbal memory, it's around verbal processing speed. And it is across the range of those intellectual abilities, and it is that continuum, as Maggie was saying. The areas of weakness that we see in the dyslexic profile are around language processing, memory. Many children I see have actually got very good visual memory, and they've used that to compensate for other areas. I see children who've been able to use their visual memory to hold those words, those whole words, to be able to help them with their reading, with their spelling, and that helps up to a certain point. But then after that, can they can't hold those longer words, can they, in their head? And they all seem to have these difficulties with speed of information processing, phonological processing, as well as the reading and spelling. But we also see the difficulties with lack of motivation, poor self-esteem as well, that make up these children's profiles. There are many factors that can affect a child's progress, and instead of jumping on and saying it's got to be around dyslexia, we've got to investigate other areas as well. We still don't know what the effects of COVID and lockdown are, and many children, I've come across children who haven't read at all during lockdown, didn't pick up one book. So it's going to have an impact, but we don't quite know what that impact is. We need to investigate other things like hearing. A lot of the children that I see have had a history of glue ear, grommets, ear infections, and that's had an impact as well. Visual difficulties. Before we do any kind of assessment, we need to have an up-to-date hearing and eyesight test and rule out those things first of all. But there are other things as well. It could be long-term illness, could be family circumstances, children not being in school because they've moved around a lot, truancy. So rather than just jumping on that it's dyslexia, we do need to investigate other things as well. The BDA have got some very good resources on their website. One of the first things that we encourage parents to do is download one of these checklists. So we've got an early years checklist, we've got a primary school checklist, a secondary school checklist, and an adult checklist. And if you have got any concerns about your child, download one of these, they're free, and just go through and just have a look at those things, whether or not any of those are starting to ring any alarm bells with you. So we might want to know about things like B's and D's, mispronouncing words. We don't normally assess till around 7 or 8, because some of these things like B's and D's, reversal, they can grow out of. But often one of the first things is a parent will be saying to a child, go upstairs, get your homework from the floor, get your dirty washing, bring something down from your bedroom, and they just can't remember any of those things. So the poor short-term working memory is one of the first things to perhaps look at. And if there is a family history of similar difficulties, that's a really good clue as well. You're talking about strengths, and Harriet was talking about creativity, but these are very articulate children. These are often children with good general knowledge, and they can make these leaps between concepts, see that big picture, and have got these very good practical thinking and reasoning skills often. We take a lot of information when we are gathering in information on a child or an adult, having an assessment. We get a lot of background information. We get information from the school. We get that information about any kind of intervention that's being carried out. We look at medical history, whether or not they're on any medication during the assessment. Whether or not they met developmental milestones, because that could give us clues about dyspraxia, for example, if they were late riding a bike, walking, talking, all of those things give us information that's really, really important. And I always remember doing an assessment on a little boy and got all of this information in and did the assessment with this child, and the child was leaving with the mother, and all of a sudden the mother turned around and said, oh, isn't it funny? Johnny was hospitalized with concussion 3 times before the age of 5. Laughed it off. But obviously, I hadn't had that information, and that really explained a lot of the difficulties. So we want to find out everything as much as we can before we even start the assessment. We want to find out the child's views about their learning and get their interpretation as well. Things that they find difficult, but also things that they're good at. And we try and make the reports as positive as possible, that we finish with a positive sentence about the child, about working with the child, and try and make it a very positive report. Now, Maggie was talking about this focus on deficit, and we are still looking for a spiky profile, sadly. And that's because our umbrella organisation, SASC, ask us to do that. And we look at the ability levels, we look at non-verbal, we look at verbal, and we do compare it with all of the other tests. And actually, sometimes that can be very positive for the child. Lots of these children, lots of these adults, they think they're stupid, and actually being able to point out to them that they're not stupid, that they've got really good skills in certain areas, can be very, very positive for them. So although we may be deficit focused, sometimes it is a positive thing, even if it is outdated. And again, here we will see these are a dyslexic profile and a non-dyslexic profile taken from an online screener. And these are becoming very popular. We've got things like Lucid Last that parents can do on Nessie if they've got any concerns and they want to take the next step after a checklist. So where do you start? If you're a parent, lots of parents come to me and say, what do I do? I think my child might be dyslexic. What do I do first? And I always tell them to go back into the school, make an appointment with the child's SENCO, see what the school will do first, but don't expect instant results for your child. Even when I've been working as a specialist teacher with children, it's taken about 18 months to see any sort of real progress with the child. So it's not going to happen overnight. Give the school the chance to put things in place and monitor progress. And if it's not working, then ask what the next step is. The BDA have got a wonderful helpline, and so I'll give you the number at the end of this talk. If you've got any concerns, contact the BDA helpline, or you may have a local dyslexia association. So Birmingham, I know, has got a local dyslexia association that gives lots of advice. And as you were saying earlier, I'm a trustee of a charity called the Adult Dyslexia Centre, and they run very cheap parents courses and have their own helpline. But I think my main advice is not to give up. Lots of parents have to really, really push to get some support for their child, and to get a local education authority psychologist is very, very difficult. So keep going, and understand that it could be quite a long process for you, but it's really worth getting that information, getting that diagnosis, and finding out how to help your child more. If you do need an assessment and you do need to find somebody who can give a private assessment, then you do need to find a specialist teacher with a level 7 qualification, with an AMDA, Associate Membership of the British Dyslexia Association, and preferably with an APC if you want the report to be used for Disabled Students Allowance. Sorry, there's lots of acronyms in the world of special needs. So Disabled Students Allowance is for university students to be able to access further funding. And actually, what can be good about that is for a child who's not been able to get any support in school, because it's a different funding stream, all of a sudden some people can get additional support at university. And if you go to a psychologist, they need to have an HCPC registration. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of background. It's only a very short talk. I just wanted to finish with a petition that the BDA are doing. And the BDA believe that the current use of systematic synthetic phonics doesn't meet the needs of all students, particularly those with dyslexia. So we're trying to get 100,000 signatures to make a difference. So there's a little QR code there. If you've got your phone, please go straight to the petition and sign it. And we'd be very, very grateful at the BDA. Hopefully, Maria will let me put that back on again at the end. And I just wanted to end with some links for you. That's the helpline, BDA helpline number, and the Adult Dyslexia Centre, and my email at the bottom. So do contact me if I can help further at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina, for a very detailed and informative talk in such a short time about approaches to the identification of dyslexia. We've only got time for one question, unfortunately, which is, what is the prevalence of dyslexia in ASD, and can you assess non-verbal children for dyslexia?
You can, there are some tests which are non-verbal, and you can get an idea, but you're not giving the full bank of tests. I'm not sure what the crossover is. I know that it's around 60% with dyspraxia, dyslexia. It's less with ASD, but we're seeing a lot more children, a lot more girls, a lot more adults with ASD being diagnosed. So we're looking out for it. And the new SAS guidance is very much around co-occurring difficulties and signposting. So it's a lot more prevalent than it was.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So now I'm going to hand back over to Maria, who will introduce our next speaker.
Yes, hi from me again. So such interesting talks from both Harriet and Katrina, and I think the view of dyslexia from different perspectives certainly gives us a general overview, an overarching view of dyslexia. Thank you so much, both of you. So on to our next speaker, and the final one for the mini live talks, Neil Mackay. So Neil Mackay, formerly a Senko in leadership roles in secondary schools, and now a UK-based consultant specializing in dyslexia and inclusion issues. Neil works internationally. Has delivered training to teachers in Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, Bangkok, Singapore, and Europe, as well as the UK, running workshops in inclusive classroom practice and meeting the needs of vulnerable learners. Back in 2019, Neil delivered a whole-day workshop called The Inclusive Habits of Outstanding Teachers to over 1,000 teachers and advisors in New Zealand. The workshop looked at validated strategies that are proven to accelerate the learning of those with additional learning needs and which enable teachers to help individuals without always needing to give individual help. So over to you, Neil.
Thank you. I can't share my screen. Somebody else is
Katrina, if
sharing.
you want to stop sharing, please.
Please. Thank you. Oh, good evening. What a fascinating series of talks that was. My theme will be then get it right for dyslexia and we get it right for all. I was smiling as Maggie was talking and Harriet and Katrina, because you'd have thought we'd actually sat down and prepared all this between us, because really I'm going to try and pull all the threads together. Before I go any further, I'm going to make a statement which may make you think that I'm against labels. I'm definitely not against labels. What I am against, though, is a child needing a label in order to get what he or she needs. Categorically against that. And building on Harriet's point, I work in FE and occasionally in HE as well as in schools. And I think part of my mission is to completely sever in the minds of teachers and academics any link between accurate reading, accurate spelling, accurate writing and intelligence. And at risk of making a rather cheap political point, our government in the current turmoil, I suspect all our cabinet ministers read and spell and write very accurately. I'm not sure I've seen much sign of intelligence, but I'll leave it there. So moving swiftly on before I get into trouble. This is a slide I use in my whole school training because one of the things that's always been said to me when I was a Senko and also as a leader is I don't have time to accommodate. I don't have time to do things differently because I've got to cover the curriculum. And what this slide shows, and I'll touch on some of these aspects, is in fact, if we do the right things at the right time, we accelerate learning. So what you'll see, for example, here is I'm talking about high expectation. And you'll see Hattie talking about the importance of a belief in the ability to succeed. Now, self-efficacy, and over on the right-hand side, then metacognition, potentially can give you 18 months progress in 12. 18 months progress in 12. If we teach phonics correctly, is 18 months progress in 12. Look at peer tutoring. Potentially 21 months progress in 12. When we do these things, we can accelerate. And what it means is that if we get these things in early enough in the low stakes years, the relatively low stakes years, so that's Key Stage 1, early Key Stage 2, early Key Stage 3, we actually do have the time to consolidate core skills. Most of the references for this are from EEF Teacher Toolkit. One or two others are there as well. So what I'll do is I'll touch on some of these as I go. I've really put this together then with some of the questions that I've been asked in my teaching. So you're in the coffee queue and a colleague sidles up to you and says, oh, if only your children would have a go. Have you noticed if you're a Senko, everybody refers them to your children, not anybody else's. Your children, if only they were more motivated. And it begs the question, are you successful because you're motivated? Or are you motivated because you're successful? Now, I usually throw this out as a discussion, and it's interesting how many people actually get it wrong. Because according to Carol Dweck, for example, success doesn't come because you're motivated. You're motivated when you're successful. So if you turn that on its head, if we look at any child currently demotivated at whatever level of ability or need, I will almost guarantee they're not being successful. So this brings immediately to bear on the point about the teacher expectation. So way back in the 1990s, this research was put together with Rosenthal and Jacobson. And the question was that if you can randomly ascribe a label to a child, a label such as gifted, does it have any effect? Remember, we're applying this label randomly. And in this research, what they discovered was that when teachers were told that certain individuals, randomly selected, would show greater intellectual development, well, they did. Teachers were told that some of their children would be expected to be growth spurters, and they did. So this comes back to my first point. If we can move forward and we can focus on the positives, Katrina made that point very well, as she does in the assessments, as did Harriet. If we start looking at the positives and we have a can-do view, then that immediately colours teachers' expectations. So there is a case there, I would argue strongly, for aiming high and assuming capability and not allowing current issues with weak basic skills to limit our expectations of our individuals. Hand in hand then with that, I would argue for much more emphasis on differentiation by outcome rather than differentiation by task. Differentiation by task means that I have to have a good idea in my head of what you can and can't do, which is almost invariably less than actually you're capable of. And it can also condemn many children to death by 1,000 worksheets, death by 1,000 colour searches. Whereas differentiation, get my teeth back in, differentiation by outcome is where I assume capability and I have multiple exit points on the way to wherever we're going to be. And this will also impact on internal assessments. I'll make that point in a bit. So where we're going here is really for universal design for learning. This is a phrase which is not quite prevalent here in the UK as it might be, but certainly internationally it is. And UD4L is about multiple means of representation. How many different ways can we find so that you can show what you know while we're waiting for your basic skills to catch up? So let's put some flesh on the bones. The feel-good factor, this is Bandura a long time ago, Carol Dweck's work will back this up, is self-efficacy, which is basically, as Ford said, if you think you can or you think you can't, you know what, you're right. Whatever you think, you're right. So if we can instill mastery, competence and confidence, then we are away. And we're going to do this through mastery learning. We're going to make sure you master it before you move on. Many of the children that colleagues watching this teach, perhaps a child who spells any with an E, said S-E-D, was W-O-S, you know, what happened there was they were moved on before they got it. They were moved on before they got the rule. They hadn't mastered it before they went. So harking back to my original slide, when I talk about mastery in whole school settings, people always say, oh, you can't do that because, well, what we do know is that we can accelerate learning if we do the right things. Therefore, arguably, we've got time to master it first. And the three key principles really, if we're going to go for mastery. And the first thing really is, and this is particularly in catch-up, we want to be time variable and learning constant rather than the other way around. So rather than try and cover the curriculum, we're going to teach the child. Time is the variable, learning is the constant. And if we can accelerate learning early on, we have the time to do it. We're also looking for a high level of success on tests and assessments, really about 80% before people progress. Now this 80% figure is fundamental to mastery learning, but it's actually fundamental to life, the universe and everything. If you or somebody in your life has passed driving tests recently, they passed it at about 80% competence. What this means is that you can pick up the other 20% on the road without killing yourself or anybody else. If you are at 75% competence, you won't pass because you cannot pick up 25% safely. And that rule of thumb applies across education as well. Round about 80%, yeah, you will pick it up as you go. Below 80%, you're going to get sequentially further and further behind. So if you're not at the 80% mark, we're talking about additional tuition, we're talking about peer support, small group work, targeted homework, inclusive accommodations, and of course differentiation. Now all those things are within the gift of a teacher in an inclusive classroom, and you don't need a label to get that. And if we accept Maggie's figures, which is 20% to 40% of learners being on the dyslexia dimension, well, it really does make sense to get this right. I'm talking more and more about a dyslexia spectrum now. I thought, well, autism's got one, why can't we have one? And I started using the term at a BDA conference a few years ago, and it's been accepted. So I think the dyslexia spectrum makes the idea of a continuum. If you're on that continuum, all these things are within the gift of our class teachers. So let's go for some high impact accommodations. I've mentioned UD4L, and that's about multiple means of representation, action, and engagement. So we're not one club players. We have many clubs in our locker to address the issues that our learners may have. So I'm arguing here then, in our very dyslexia-friendly classroom, much more differentiation by outcome, this assumption of capability, despite currently weak basic skills. And this is driven by an assumption of capability, and it's powered by inclusive accommodations. So let's have a look at some of these. This is a learner's response to a question in a history test. What happened during a Viking raid? Why were they so successful? And in this test, because the school had bought into the notion of UD4L, some of the questions actually specify you can only respond in a non-traditional way. So sentences and paragraphs are not acceptable. You can mind map it, you can storyboard it, you can flowchart it, and this is what this youngster did. Now, I'm not saying it's great, but what I am saying is it indicates that the teacher has taught well, and it indicates that this youngster has got what he or she should take from the lesson. And more to the point, that's markable against any mark scheme, tick, tick, tick. And while it may not be a 10 out of 10 answer, it'll be worth a lot more than if he or she had to do it traditionally. And it's well worth, if you put in these non-traditional assessment questions, comparing the marks a learner gets non-traditionally with traditional. If they get more marks in a non-traditional way, what we know is the barrier is not teaching, it's not learning, it's actually accessing the information. Here's another one, history. The main features of a medieval cottage, and again the test said label diagram only please. When I'm doing training I say, how markable is this? They say, well, it's infinitely markable. And then I ask the question, does it have to be written up properly? And sadly some of our colleagues still think it does. The reality of course is it doesn't. You can scan that in, there's your evidence. Ofsted will love it. And just as a quick aside, I don't know what you think, but I think the expression on the peasant's face is a real social comment. And what about that? It says so much, doesn't it? Would we have got that had it been written? Probably not. So the message is in the evidence, and I think empowering our youngsters to master the mind map, the storyboard, the flow chart, the bullet point early on is key. How early? Probably age 7 in primary. I live in North Wales, and a little primary school in Newtown. The youngsters have mastered this before they leave, and it's great. If you're in secondary and the youngsters come through without these skills, I would have thought by Christmas in year 7, if they've mastered these, certainly I made that my priority, it made such a difference. And it's valid to ask, we can't go into discussion in this setting, what is the case for this, what's the place for this? You would be delighted how many schools where I throw out this challenge are happy to respond to it. So what about the research? If we're not doing this, why aren't we doing it? Let's have a look. Discovery method is a no-no. It doesn't work, so the learning pit is not a place to go, especially if you're dyslexic. What we do know though, is that if we give our youngsters worked examples and we show them exactly how to do it, it is much better than letting them discover. And this research is showing that learners who require to solve problems without being given the tablets perform worse on subsequent tests. So our modelling, our showing exactly how to do it the first time is key. And that's also important because the first time a child meets a new idea, concept or skill, they need to get it right. Get it right first time and you become successful, you're motivated. Underneath that, look at that, 4 blocks of study with practice tests outperforms 8 blocks of study without. So just by putting in practice tests, you can go twice as fast, or you can slow down at the start and speed up at the end. And quizzing is proving to be such a powerful thing. Low stakes or no stakes quizzes where nobody actually cares how you do improves learning, memory and retention. Open book quizzes are fantastic, and some researchers are even advocating cheating where necessary, because what it does is emphasize what you don't know. Learner generated quizzes for our children, dyslexic children, are particularly powerful because of their ability to come up with higher level thinking questions, Socratic questions, is often remarkable. One more thing there, I'll touch on comprehension. A colleague comes up and says, look, how can I get them to understand when they struggle to read the words? I'm a believer in phonics. I'm a total believer in systematic synthetic phonics. The work of David Kirkpatrick shows that even when we read words as, if like a whole word, we're still decoding them in our brain. However, if you're having a problem with that, we need a strategy to help you through. I forgot to say on this context, a friend and a colleague of mine who's a professor in Tasmania is just about to pass a PhD student, dyslexic PhD student, who is totally illiterate. He cannot read, he cannot write, he cannot spell, and he will get his PhD because he's using alternative technology and all his abilities are being channeled in through other means. I think that's incredibly validating. So here we have a problem, can't read the words, what do we do? Well, I'll quickly take you through a seminal study, which is baseball on comprehension. And what happened here was that groups of students heard the same story, they read the story, they had a model, and the makeup was quite interesting because you had learners who were good readers with a good knowledge of baseball. You had good readers with a poor knowledge of baseball, poor readers with a good knowledge of baseball, and poor readers who knew nothing about it at all. I then I asked colleagues to think what the ranking is likely to be. And then I show them this slide and I ask them what they get from it. So I'll give you a few seconds to have a look at it. What is the message from this in the context of dyslexia? Specifically learners who think faster than they read. What I take from it is that obviously, if you read well and you know a lot, you understand a lot and you do well in the comprehension afterwards. But look at the group that came second. It wasn't the good readers who didn't know much about baseball. It was the poor readers who had high subject knowledge. So skipping through this very quickly, what we know is that prior knowledge can really compensate for a lack of reading ability, a lack of decoding. Weaker readers will comprehend nearly as well as stronger readers if they've been introduced to the key elements before reading a passage. And I know this is valid in Key Stage 1, 2, 3 and 4, definitely 5, into FE, into HE, no doubt at all. So to conclude, my takeaways for, if you like, a dyslexia-friendly classroom environment is high expectations based on thinking, not accuracy of reading, spelling or writing. Set them up to succeed, UD4L, demand multiple representations so that currently weak basic skills are not a barrier to ability appropriate achievement. High impact whole class accommodations. Everything I've talked to you about tonight works on a whole class basis, helping individuals without giving individual help. And always set the context before reading. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Neil, for such a thought-provoking talk. We've got time only for one question. So we have a question. What is your view, Neil, of using phonics with SEN adults?
What a great question. I have used phonics with SEN adults and also with in sixth form and FE. You have to be very emotionally intelligent, I guess. And the adults I've worked with, I have asked their permission to work with them at a level they may perceive to be condescending or inappropriate. And the analogy I always draw is that if you had injured yourself, you might have to learn to walk again. So you might have to go back to crawling. There's this sort of thing. So really, it depends on the adult. If the adult is up for it, I'm going to say definitely synthetic phonics is the way to start. If they don't know that, if they can't link letters and sounds together, they're going to find it very difficult. There are some adults, like some children, who don't get phonics, in which case we'll have to use other approaches. But if an adult will go with me, that is where I would start.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Neil. Okay, so this was the last of our mini live talks. I think, well, we've overrun a bit, but I find it all very exciting. Hope everyone does too. I'd like to thank Maggie Snowling, if she can hear us, Katrina, Harriet, Neil, and Vicky. My sincere thanks to these very, very interesting contributions to this webinar. Thank you all speakers and attendees for such interesting discussions and questions posed by the audience. I kept the conversation going. I think we have covered a number of areas around the field of dyslexia, and it's only an hour and 15 minutes. As we have seen in the talks, and I totally agree that dyslexia is a continuum. That's what I'm going to keep as well. But I'm also going to keep how the different dyslexia perspectives inform our research and our practice. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think the information that each one of us is going to take home tonight will be adjusted to the needs to our needs as educators and researchers, to the needs of our learners that come from a variety of backgrounds, cultural and language backgrounds, who are assessed in different ways depending on where they are, and who can be supported depending on the educational structures of their context and the views of dyslexia, of course, of their context. So what I'm saying is, I don't think as well, I totally agree with the speakers, no two learners with dyslexia are the same, but research and practice are here to help us produce educationally meaningful improvements for each one of them. So as we've seen from tonight, dyslexia, we could talk hours and hours around dyslexia research and practice. Dyslexia is a massive field. However, with our event tonight, hopefully we try to explore in depth some of the key topics that surround it. And thank you all for being part of this. Please fill in the feedback forms that you're going to get in your emails, and we'll upload the presentations on the website together with the recording of the event. And I think that's for me saying have a good evening. Thank you all. Thank you speakers. Thank you, Vicky. Thanks everyone. Thank you, George. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Maria.